Good to see colleagues here from Transformation Office, because there will be a number of conversations that will continue after this one as well. Eusebius, it is great to see you again and to have you back on campus after you're officially part of the campus conversation about history and about statues and about running away and about coming back, etc. It's great to have you here and for you to open this Discourse Café. It is the third for the year. And a number of others to follow. Christina Teichmann from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation is here today, the sponsor for our Discourse Cafés, amongst others. Christina, it is great to have you here and for us to continue the conversation on that level as well. I hope that it will be a fruitful one and that the disturbances in between will allow for better conversations and not the other way around. But from my side, officially welcome.
Thank you, Leslie.
Introduce you and the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Onlangse. I'm going to introduce our guest today. I don't even think he needs any introduction, but I'll say a few words. He's a political analyst, a broadcaster, a writer, and he's also a former national and master debate champion. He has written 3 books, and today we are fortunate to have his last book, Run Racist Run, Journey to the Heart of Racism. So what we're going to do is going to talk to us, then afterwards we'll answer any questions. So ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Mr. Eusebius McKaiser.
Thank you. Thank you, Simonello. Thanks for getting me to come here. It's been trying very hard to get me to come and working with my PA to make sure that it happens. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to you as well for coming to engage on such a difficult conversation around race and racism, which we have to. And it's also nice to see so many familiar faces again. How's it, Faith? But the last time I saw some of you here, including Leslie, I wore a different hat as a sort of facilitator of a conversation. So it's nice to be here and being able to speak bluntly about my own convictions. And I want us to have a frank conversation, because racism is frank. So talking about it can't be polite. I don't know what your interests are specifically. The racism conversation, as I said to Sibonello, has many subsections to it, and so I'm going to make some remarks to give you a sense of what the book is about, and I will say 1 or 2 things that are not in the book about what my experiences has been so far, taking the book on tour around the country, and also 1 or 2 trips to England. And then I will leave it there and we can talk about anything I remarked on, anything else that's on your mind related to the book, or even if it's not, I'm happy for us to have the widest possible conversation, because I'll just be guessing what it is that's salient for you, and it may not be the same that is salient for me. I guess firstly the question is, why did I even decide to write the book Run Racist Run, when one can write about many different things? Anyone who has perhaps already read the book or heard me talk about it will know that it's with a certain amount of regret that I wrote the book. When I wrote the book, I was busy with a different book provisionally entitled Searching for Sello Daker. I'm obsessed with Sello Daker. He's one of my favorite South African novelists in the democratic era, and his life fascinates me. As a philosophy student, I'm fascinated by questions around meaning, and the older I get, the more aware of my mortality. I'm also interested in philosophical and ethical questions that are raised by illness and by death, and our attitudes towards illness and death. So if it was up to me, I'd be on a book tour in the country, doing a tour that deals and engages questions around illness, death, and meaning, which is where my philosophical interests currently lie. I did not wish to write a book about race. My first collection of essays, A Bunt in My Bathroom, was 33% about race, and so it's a reluctant book that I wrote. And not that I needed to write it. There are many books on race and racism that are good, many voices that are good. My voice is not a necessary one, but as a writer, I disrupted the book that I was actually working on to write this book. And the reason for it was that it struck me, firstly, as a luxury to be able to write about the ordinary, as Njabula Ndebele calls it. The imaginary daffodils outside our outside our windows, questions about the meaning of life are questions you can ask when your life is banal. And banality is a beautiful luxury. South Africa, arguably politically, has become banal on the international stage. Sometimes it frightens us. I think in some ways it's good, because the more banal you become, it means you're getting on with being ordinary, and ordinary is an achievement. Black life is not ordinary, because racism is thrust upon us. And so to have the luxury, middle class or racially or otherwise, to hit the pause button on racism and say, I'm going to write a book that explores the connections between mental illness and creativity, which is my interest in Sello Dacre, who is known for his output, but his own personal life is not very well understood. And he was someone who suffered mental illness, and probably an important part of the reason why he committed suicide. To be able to write a book that is detached from overt political questions is a luxury, a psychological luxury that many black writers do not yet have. Many do, of course, have the versatility to write about a range of issues, not just identity politics. And sometimes we get reduced to that, when our oeuvre is actually much broader than the way we are read as black writers. But I felt that there were questions that had confronted me anew about race that I wanted to explore for myself, and they were far more urgent than this big project around Sello Dacre and thematically around illness, death and meaning. So that's what was happening with me as a writer at the time that I put the pause, decided to put a pause on that project and write this book. Obviously, the context of the various decolonization movements on campuses gave particular urgency to exploring questions around race and racism more deeply than we ever have as a country. So the combination of personal curiosity and the context of the country over the last 2 years convinced me that it's worth putting that project on hold and then writing this book that explores a range of questions that I hadn't addressed for myself before, and many people have addressed some of them. So I want to give you a sense of the kinds of questions that preoccupied me and that this book is about. Stylistically, the book is very similar to what my writing has become in the last 5 years or so, which is that I use first-person narrative, and I use that as a device through which to construct philosophical argument. Friends of mine who are philosophy students or philosophers, competitive debaters, will probably mostly skip the first half of my essays and get on with the argument. But in a country where you have massive educational disparities, and this is the most important thing I've learned on radio as a talk show host, you've got to draw people into a conversation. You've got to speak plainly, you've got to use narrative, you've got to use personal stories. So that's stylistically what I do in my work, and I do it deliberately. And in that sense, there's an echo between my first book and this book, because I've used the same strategy. Perhaps if there's one difference, this book is maybe marginally less egotistical than the first, because I've also decided to foreground other voices much more than I have before. But again, the stories are just heuristic devices to get me to the arguments. If I lived in a different context or in a different time, I would have cut a lot of the personal narrative stuff and simply get on with argument. But I am more convinced now than when I started writing this book that the first person essay, the personal essay, is a very important genre, and even more politically important than I'd realized when I set out to use that technique. So stylistically, the book is very similarly constructed as my first book, A Bunt in My Bathroom. The issues are different, and the issues have moved on, and I've moved on. I suspect the biggest difference from where I was at, we were talking about this in the car earlier, is that I'm much angrier than I was before. And there's a tonal difference. I have discovered, for example, the joy of saying fuck off in a university setting, which is wonderfully liberating. Whereas previously I would have been incredibly polite, as I was taught at an English high school, at Rhodes University and at Oxford. So there's a tonal shift in my politics, and I have taken a lurch to the left, which is maybe why so many people believed my April Fool's joke that I've joined the EFF and started career politics. That's not where I was at a couple of years ago. There is some ideological continuity, I'm still a liberal, and unashamedly so, and I don't think that liberalism is incompatible with radical black thought. So I'm certainly no chameleon. I believe in the gospel of John Stuart Mill. I believe that liberal individualism is the right basic blueprint for society. But on very specific racial questions, I think it's very clear that this book is a much more uncomfortable read, especially for my white English liberal friends, than anything else that I've written. So that's a tonal shift that I definitely own. And in fact, I have an essay that speaks to that, entitled Anger Misunderstood, which is a defense of both the moral value and the instrumental value of getting angry and demonstrating anger in conversation. I'm not going to touch on that here unless it comes up in conversation. I sort of randomly picked one or two essays that I just want to give you a high-level description of. The one that got the most immediate traction, and much to my ego boost, has been taught at Oxford already, is essay number 7, entitled Meritocracy, White Excellence and Other Myths. And that is an essay that I thought about again yesterday when I looked at the Zapiro cartoon. How many of you saw Zapiro's cartoon yesterday? Deeply problematic cartoon. And if you haven't seen it, it's very simple. It's a cartoon of Alistair Coetzee, one eye that way, the other eye that way, 2 balls being thrown at him, and someone from the sidelines shouting, catch it, or something to that effect. And the one ball says transformation, and the other ball says winning. Now, obviously, that peddles the racist lie that transformation and winning are mutually exclusive, which is nonsense. And then there are interesting additional lies, because as racism goes, there are always layers to these things. There's also the assumption that the status quo is a winning status quo. But if you know the record of the box, it's not exactly a winning formula that we're trying to trade off with transformation. So there's this construction of a meritocracy in the status quo that is just a lie about the status quo. And it's not just a lie about the Springboks, it's also a lie about meritocracies existing in institutions. And I had a conversation with the corporate this morning, 10 minutes from here, where something similar played out, where transformation is pitted against a narrative of excellence and a narrative of meritocracy. But in the first instance, besides the conceptual problem that transformation is not by design anti-winning, anti-meritocracy, there's just an empirical lie. There's a lie about in how we describe the institutions in which we operate, as if meritocracies are already established in our institutions, whether they be our universities, whether they be our national sports teams, and who gets selected and how they get selected, or whether we're talking about climbing the ladder in corporate South Africa. And that's a myth that I talk about in this particular essay. Like many men, we're trying to learn the grammar of gender equality, and we're rightly being kept on our toes by black feminist women in particular, so it's a journey. But what I use throughout the book is an analogy constantly from gender to race. And sometimes if you're uncomfortable with one theme, you may not be with another. Try and learn lessons from another theme and bring it back to the one that you're uncomfortable with. And I try and do that as I move between gender analysis and race. And I found myself with a corporate in Sandton where the corporate had basically asked a world-class researcher, who happens to be a woman, to do research about the experiences of black people and women in the company, of the company. And this company is a company which almost everyone in this room, no doubt, either do or within the first month that you work will be a member of. It's a company that conceives of itself as one of the top brands in the country. They employ 8,000 people. They see themselves as extremely progressive. And so they were shocked when this deep qualitative and quantitative research came back and basically showed that black people and women in the company have very alienating experiences, that those employees' experience of the company is very different to what the board's narrative is when they talk about the company, and also quite frankly different to the connotations of the company, I think, in popular South African discourse. I never got their permission to mention them, that's why I'm not mentioning the name of the company. But there was a clear difference between what the board thought of the company and the actual experiences being reported by women and by black people in the company. And the dominant narrative that's being told by the board is that this is a company that values meritocracy. gives equal opportunities to everyone, but it's fundamentally a meritocracy. But the question that never confronted is, how is it that if your company is a meritocracy, how come, especially in top management and your leadership structure and on your board, it is mostly straight white men, and in this particular case, straight white Jewish men who dominate those positions? Because if you live in a just society where effort and talent alone determine where you end up in a company, then you should have roughly similar demographics between your country's population and the leadership population, the leadership demographics in your company. So let's just slow down a little bit. Put it this way. If you have up to 90% of your population black, how do you account for the fact that there's an overrepresentation of white people in general and white men in particular in corporate South Africa, right? That's the question. Now, if you believe in the meritocracy narrative, and you unpack what that meritocracy narrative implies, then you are suggesting, and this is what I argue in this essay at any rate, then you are suggesting that there are two factors that account for white success, and these two factors alone: genetic good luck plus hard work. And if you believe that, then your belief is racist, because the logical implication of imagining hard work and genes to account for white successes in corporate South Africa is that you are suggesting that women and black people either have inferior biology or they're lazy. Because that's the only way genes plus hard work can give you a complete account of success. Can only do so if you believe that women and black people are lazy and or have genetic inferiority. So if you accept that it's obviously not the case, that Mother Nature randomly distributes talents amongst the human population, then it means that even if some part of the story of how Meneer van der Merwe became the CEO involves 10,000 hours of hard work, that it can never be the complete story. The most you can conclude, without collapsing into racist or sexist or patriarchal assumptions, is that hard work and genes give you a partial story of why it is that, let's say, 60% of middle managers and top tier managers in corporate South Africa are white. That's the most you can conclude. It leaves the obvious question, what accounts for the full story? And the answer is not particularly rocket science. It is centuries and centuries and present day institutional racism that continues. And that kind of structural inequity that is based on colonialism, apartheid, and everyday racism that continues in our institutions is the missing part of the explanation for why you have disproportionate representation of men and disproportionate representation of white people in key positions in society, leadership positions. Your top students, I was at a FVZS graduation ceremony a week or two ago, and of the handful of students who get their degrees with distinction, 99% of them that went across the stage were white. You can either conclude that white people are genetically more likely to pass cum laude, or you can recognize that even if that student had put in many hours in third year, that the hours you put in and your genetic profile give you a partial account of why you were likely to be the student getting that cum laude. And of course it's a partial story. The rest of the story is your life story before you entered FVZS. And that has nothing to do with genes, got nothing to do with effort, got everything to do with the structural inequities that determine what your prospects are in first year to be that student that will get one of the few cum laudes by the time you graduate. And so there's a myth around the idea that meritocracy accounts for life in corporate South Africa, and that when we talk about transformation, hence I think rightly so the critique against Zapiro, that when we talk about transformation, that we're trying to undo this beautiful, perfect meritocracy. And then of course people slip into prescriptions like, if only we deal with education and training in the long run, we'll be okay. But it's an attempt to try and protect the status quo from critique. The idea that the straight white man's position in society is one that he achieved through incredible hard work plus genetic luck. And I think we need to push back against that. It's an empirical lie, and it's a lie that, if you believe it, commits you to both a racist view about black people's struggle and also a patriarchal and sexist, violently sexist view about women's capabilities, if you believe that. In parentheses, I think people struggle with that truth because we all like to believe that efforts and hard work really account for where we are at today when we have succeeded. And that's why the gender analogy for me is instructive when it comes to questions around racism. For example, I've had pretty good career success as a competitive debater. I've won the national title, the world masters title, and some other titles in between. And luck played an important role in why I won some of these titles. And you can either accept that effort and genes alone do not account for your successes as a male competitive debater who's done well, which I think is the right thing to do, or if you believe that effort plus genetic propensity wholly account for the success of male competitive debaters, then you have to take on board the idea that female debaters are naturally inferior to male debaters on the circuit. I don't know how many of you, if any of you, have done competitive debating out of interest, either at high school or in university. So when you look at, I've been involved in debating since high school. I did Standard 6 in 1992. I took up debating just to learn to speak English, and then I became addicted to it. And I've been involved in university debating with various degrees of involvement since 1997. So I've had a good view of South African debating and international debating over a long period of time. And in my experience, if you take the top 100 speakers in the world consistently, at least 90% of them are men. But it's interesting because the men who succeed, who win the world championship title, who win the national title, are not lazy. I wasn't handed my national title on a silver platter. I put in the hours. So when you have memory, true memory, of putting in the proverbial 10,000 hours, then it's understandable, I would venture to say, why Eusebius may think that his debating CV is fully accounted for by genetic luck combined with effort. Because after all, I've got the receipts to prove that I put in the 10,000 hours. But the reality is that, and this is the way I broke it down to this board in Joburg, if you look at the scorecard at a competitive debate tournament, you get about, roughly, everyone gets a mark out of 100 points. You get about, 30 points for the quality of your evidence, about 30 points, 40 points for your strategic thinking as a debater, and you get like 30 points for style. So you have me speaking and debating against Faith. Faith may have more insight than I have into whatever the debating topic is of the day, and Eusebius still wins the debate. Now you go to the judges afterwards and you're like, out of interest, what can I learn? Because secretly you think you should have won, but you sheepishly say, can you give me some advice on how to be better so that next time I can beat this guy who's always winning? And they will say, well, your arguments will rise, strategically you were okay. I just didn't think you were that persuasive. Now the key question under the criterion of style of speaking is, are you persuasive? Now persuasiveness is not black and white. We can evaluate evidence objectively. Your empirical facts may either be true or false. That we can evaluate objectively. Being persuaded is a psychological phenomenon, which is why there are limits to how you can respond if someone says, I'm not persuaded. You've got to know when to walk away. Short of taking a cricket bat, being persuaded is a mental state. Someone is either persuaded or they're not. But if you unpack that, you suddenly find that the implicit biases in favor of male-centric characteristics are the basis on which a woman is typically not found to be a persuasive speaker, both in competitive debate, in our institutions, when promotion comes up in law firms across the country, because a loud voice, a physical presence, looking you in the eye, walking up to you, those are all markers we take of persuasive speaking. And unsurprisingly, those markers piggyback on typically male behavior. And so built into our criteria for what it means to be a persuasive debater is basically who can be the most aggressive, who's got the most open body posture and comportment. All of those things count. And so when a female speaker or any feminine speaker, whether you're biologically male or female, someone who's got a small comportment, soft voice, and linguistically doesn't speak in assertions, but owns lack of certainty. I'm still puzzling through this, I'm not quite sure. Anyone who communicates like that is seen as not yet ready for a leadership position, not yet a persuasive speaker. And that's where your penis as a man gives you unearned privileges. And the lesson of that story is that the proper full account of why consistently 90% of the top 100 speakers in the world on the competitive debate circuit are male, it's not because women are inferior genetically or put in less effort. It's actually just because there's an implicit bias in the way in which all of us are socialized to pick out what persuasive debaters sound like, look like, behave like in front of an audience, and that carries over into competitive debate. It also carries over into our institutional markers for who should be granted leadership positions, who should get promotions at work. And I see this all the time, get asked to help someone on the brink of promotion in a law firm, but you see, but they're just not asserting themselves as they should amongst the other partners. So can we just work on this, because 6 months before the promotion discussion comes up, and we'd love to get this woman to make partner. When I spend time with that person, I realize there's nothing bloody wrong with this person's communicative skill set, but there's everything wrong with the criteria that is set up for evaluating whether they are persuasive. Now I want to bring that back to the race conversation. When you have put in many, many hours practicing to beat John, who's also white like yourself, as Johannes, to become the first team rugby captain at St. John's College, it must feel insulting, if you don't think about it, when someone says to you, luck played an important role in accounting for how it is you became the first team rugby captain, how it is you became head prefect, and how it is that you became eventually COO of some bank. But only if you don't think about it. Because the truth is that you were competing against, at most, 6-7% of children in the country. So you immediately had structural unearned privileges, just in virtue of the resources that your parents could afford sending you already to a private school, for example. And so luck entered its life at the point at which you were born. Luck accompanied you in the school choices that were made on your behalf with resources available to you. And so the fact that you worked very, very, very hard to be able to get that gold medal at the Science Expo in Pretoria does not mean that luck never entered the story of your life. But I have more sympathy than some of my black friends for white people who are under the illusion that effort and genetics completely account for some of their successes. Because I know where that impulse comes from. Because not every single person who is white and is in a position of achievement was given it in a simple cronyist transaction. Many would have put in the hours, but the hours give you the experiential illusion that luck never came into the equation. And I think it's a myth that we need to slay. Because the reality is that when someone vouches for you, when someone sponsors you, when someone mentors you, those are all things that have nothing to do with inherent effort. Those are the ways in which social capital gives you a massive head start over someone who doesn't come from a similar background as you. And I find this, for example, when I mentor potential Black Rhodes Scholars, and I'm one of the selectors for the Rhodes Scholarship. If no one ever had a conversation with you about what it's like being in a scholarship interview, it's much harder going into that interview and succeeding than if Aunt Sally had gone on a scholarship program before. And of course we can talk about exceptions. There are black kids who now have that narrative in their family. There are some white kids who don't. But if we're going to be talking about anecdote rather than patterns, we're going to get nowhere. The patent reality is that in general, those kind of structural advantages still mean that the average white person is more likely to access those opportunities earlier than the average black person. So that's what I deal with in that essay. The essay that I feared I'd get the most pushback from is entitled Racism Receipts. Racism Receipts, which is a concept that was introduced to me by a very good friend of mine, and I think one of our most talented young writers, Daniela Bowler, who was just absolutely fabulous. Really, really, really brilliant. If you don't know her, Google her, read her writing. She's busy with a fantastic overdue book on colored identity that I really am looking forward to. And she's very sassy and hip and into popular culture. Can probably write a PhD on Beyonce as much as she can on complicated postmodern theory. So incredible versatility in her thinking and her intellectual curiosity. So she introduced me to the basic concept. And then I use some of my philosophical and legal convictions to construct a full argument around the idea of racism receipts. There's this tendency of thinking that unless I can prove to you with incredible scientific rigor that someone was motivated by racism, I'm not in a position to say that I'm a victim of racism. So I wanted to raise a general question in this essay asking, might there be occasions on which an assumption of racism is defensible and acceptable? And for me, the answer is yes. You cannot live in a society, and obviously the full argument is here. I'm just giving you my point of view now. I don't have time to tease the argument out because I want us to get into conversation. But you cannot live in a country that is saturated with racism and pretend that racism is so rare that when someone sincerely reports an experience of racism, that you need to hear them skeptically until you have incontrovertible proof that what they experienced was indeed racism and that the person was motivated by racism. And I say that for many reasons, and I'll give you a taste of the direction the argument goes in. One, which I guess is sort of philosophical, counterfactual point. If you think that someone sincerely reporting an experience of racism should be doubted until you have incontrovertible proof that they experience racism, then what you are implying is that the norm in society is non-racism. You can only be surprised by a claim about racism if a student comes into your office, if a friend tells you about an experience, if a colleague comes in and you're the manager. The skepticism about whether they are accurately reporting an incidence of racism, that skepticism would only be justified if you live in a non-racist society. But if you accept that racism is not rare, but racism is the norm, then the routine experience of racism means that reporting racism experiences shouldn't surprise you, and therefore skepticism is actually unjustified. Okay. I think here gender politics help us. I think the following statement is perfectly defensible. Bill Cosby is a rapist. I don't think that I need a court of law to find Bill Cosby guilty of rape before I can say that he's a rapist. And I can happily say that into the recording without fear of legal consequence or audio-visual recording. And the reason is this. I don't think he should be thrown in jail until he has been found guilty of a crime beyond reasonable doubt. We need to distinguish legal norms from social discourse. Legal norms, and in particular the evidential standard in criminal law, should never be lowered, because the cost of finding you guilty of a crime is very high. Your reputational damage, restriction of movement, your life comes to a halt, it can be irreversibly disrupted. So when society deems you a criminal and then sanctions you, there are horrendous social and personal and psychological consequences for the convicted criminal. And that is why we have built jurisprudentially into criminal law such a high evidential bar for when we chuck you into prison and when we call you a criminal. And that's fine. But legal standards are not the only standards that matter in society, and they shouldn't be. Right? I mean, I would be very surprised if everyone in this room will wait until a court of law has pronounced on President Jacob Zuma's relationships with the Guptas, for example, before you have a belief about whether or not you think the president is corrupt. So the question is, are you irresponsible not to wait for a court to tell you? Many of you will have a view about his sexual relationship that led to the rape trial. The question is, should the court settle the range of things you want to say about the president? And the answer is no, it shouldn't. Not because we need to have low standards when we hold each other accountable outside the court in social and political discourse, but actually because the law isn't always concerned with common sense truth and with probabilities of what is the case. The law itself doesn't even have a consistent standard it applies, which is why in civil law we use balance of probabilities, but in criminal law we use beyond reasonable doubt. So someone may not be found guilty of murdering your relative, but you might still be able to get damages out of them in a civil case, right? So the law itself recognizes that for different social functions, we need to apply different evidential standards depending on what the purpose is behind a particular conversation. Now, if you know anything about sexual violence and rape, you will know that the chances of someone falsely claiming they've been raped are highly improbable. Now imagine you're talking about tens of women across generations who have a lot to lose. None of them have an incentive in terms of trying to blackmail Bill Cosby into giving them money. Many have incredible careers that are already giving them lots of money and accolades. You will be labeled a rape survivor if you're lucky, most probably a rape victim, not even a survivor, with all its connotations. Many people will think that you are hating on this man. Bill Cosby, you can go to many, especially historically black colleges in the States, and take cultural studies courses about the Cosby Show and its role that it played, supposedly, in helping black Americans to really reimagine a different way of being, rather than being downtrodden. We had the same in South Africa. And I say supposedly because I think that's a lovely discussion worth having, whether it helped or hindered trying to get black people access to opportunities. I think sometimes, especially white liberals, can also take it as a reference point. Why can't you all be like Dr. Huxtable? So it also lulls people in a false sense of security about what needs to be done, right? But that aside, to go up against this man who is this incredible giant figure in black cultural history, you have much more reason to carry silently your experience than to speak out. The laws against you, conviction rates are incredibly low. It does not make sense that when so much is stacked up against you as a survivor of sexual violence, that you will put up your hand and you will say, Eusebius raped me, Eusebius drugged me. And of course it gets worse in this particular case, because the more the man concedes some of the facts, the more it actually just corroborates the stories of the survivors in terms of the kinds of drugs and stuff that he basically just gave them in drinks, etc. And so I think to say to a woman who comes to you, 20 women come to you, don't know each other from a bath soap, have lots to lose, the criminal justice system is against them, it's adversarial, the entire, in South Africa until recently, and even now it happens when the cameras are not there, your whole sexual history can be dragged out in court, you'll be cross-examined, it's horrible. You will have the violence re-inscribed on your body when you take the stand. When all of that is stacked against you, then I ask, do you really need a court of law to pronounce before you're going to believe the stories of the women? I think you are silly. In fact, I would say, quite frankly, I mean, the depths of sexism and just sheer stupidity on a probabilistic reasoning to imagine that unless and until you have a smoking gun, you can't believe the story of the women who report their experiences at the hand of Bill Cosby. I think you've gone nuts. Racism for me is exactly the same, because racism is as entrenched in the fabric of our society as the attacks on women's bodies in this society. And so the default should be to believe women who report experiences of sexual violation and sexual violence. The default should be to believe someone when they report experiences of racism. Doesn't mean that every story will turn out to have been true. No. Does the fact that one story might be false mean that you shouldn't believe the stories? No. No, that's equally irrational. Because you have to be guided by what the pattern of reality in your society is. And the title of that essay, Racism Receipts, points to that bizarre expectation that if Eusebius says he had a racist encounter, unless there was some sort of expert on racism said, yep, Mr. McKaiser, I hereby declare, having investigated the facts, that indeed you experienced racism yesterday in Mr. van der Merwe's office. Here's your receipt. Whenever you talk about your racism experience, you can give this receipt to your audience and it will be incontrovertible proof that you're not lying. No. You do not need racism receipts in order to be believed. There's something perverse about that. You only demand racism receipts or sexual violence receipts if you think the norm in society is non-racism, or if you think the norm in society is respect for women. If you accept that disrespect is the normal experience of women in our society, then I think skepticism about the reports of sexual violence become completely undue. Okay, I was going to talk about next to prayer, but there's no reason to upset myself. So I'm going to say a little bit just about the anger bit, and then I'll stop there. You know, my anger essay was fascinating for me because I got accused, and I understand why, of policing black anger last year. We had the Ruth First Fellowship, which is two fantastic fellows last year, Panashe and Sasonke, who gave fantastic lectures in the Wits Great Hall, and great discussion about race and racial identity ensued. And a black student man went to the mic during the Q&A that I was moderating, and at some point while he was speaking, or someone else was speaking, he actually grabbed the mic and he said, "Fuck white people," quote unquote, and I threatened to eject him and basically ask the mic to be taken away. And of course, in these flawless times where we really scrutinize behavior and all speech acts very closely, for the next couple of weeks, my black receipts were taken away from me until I had to do penance. And what was interesting there, of course, is that the funny thing was, as I was being engaged on whether I'd handled the situation correctly as a moderator or whether I was pandering to the civility of liberals, black and white, but especially white liberals, by trying to police the way in which the discourse was unfolding. The funny thing was that this book was already on its way to the printers, and I had written a whole essay in which I defended the importance of getting angry and exhibiting your anger when it comes to social justice discussions around race and racism. So I had to do some deep introspection whether on that occasion I was busted. I still don't think I was, but then I am a competitive debater, so we do come around a little bit longer than the rest of the universe with honesty. But if it is fair to say that I fell short of my own argument in the book, it wouldn't be surprising. In the same way in which I said to you, those of us who now suddenly love calling ourselves black feminist men, 5 minutes later it turns out that most of us are still hoteps. So it takes practice to be able to do the things that you can speak about dispassionately. So it wouldn't surprise me that I sometimes, especially in the presence of white people, because my proximity to whiteness is something that obviously I was taught in high school and university, that I fall back into the patterns that I don't think I ought to when I reflect on them. There's this tendency of believing that if you get pissed off and you show yourself to be pissed off, that you are losing control of a conversation and an argument. And that you always need to be very calm when you are engaging questions to do with transformation or decolonization or patriarchy or racism or homophobia or transphobia or all the other social injustices in society. And particularly, which is the bit that particularly irks me, if you want to persuade more people who are beneficiaries of the status quo to become good allies with you, then you need to know how to engage them, because you don't want to alienate people who can potentially be on your side, right? So that's the tactical logic for why you should be calm. And I want to call bullshit on that for a couple of reasons. The first and the most important is that there's no such thing as neutral rules of engagement. And this is something which I now grapple with as a moderator. The idea of neutral rules of engagement, I think, have been smashed quite nicely by students across the world with all the activism that's happened in the last year. And I'm glad that it's been smashed. Someone always benefits from the rules of engagement. It's very hard to come up with politically or socially neutral rules of engagement. I mean, let's take the worst example, right, from restorative justice principles in law. And sadly, this sometimes still happens in some of our rural areas in particular, where some of these principles are often rehearsed more so than in urban areas. If someone has been violated by someone else, you can't say to the victim, listen, Eusebius, I'm going to get you into the room. The guy who raped you is there. Please don't get upset. Take a deep breath, count to 10, because I want to talk this through. Because you guys still have to live together in the village. You all go in. Are you calm? Fine. Okay, let's go in. The problem with that approach is that the perpetrator benefits from the civility. Because the container that you built is not a neutral container. You built a container that reinforces part of the violence that was experienced by the victim and the survivor of the sexual violence in the illustrated example. If I was raped, I'm entitled to be pissed off. If I'm not pissed off, I think there's something morally incomplete about my own response to my violation. At the very least, I should be the one choosing the tone of my response to this person that I'm now being asked to engage in dialogue with. And there's something really callous about saying to me, please keep calm. It's for all of our sake. Before we start today's conference, here are the rules. And I want us to agree on these rules. No one will speak out of turn, agreed. Everyone will put up their hand. And you've all been to these conferences, right? And that happens. But what we've never given real thought to is who benefits from these rules we set out when we go to Spear, when we go to off-site for an evening of wonderful conversation. You bring all these disparate students and management together. It is invariably people who currently benefit from the dominant narrative who benefit from those rules of engagement. So rules of engagement are never neutral. And that's a notion we need to disabuse ourselves of. And so to say to a victim of racism, please be calm when you go into this conversation, we'd really like to make progress and find each other, is effectively to ask that person to shut down a very important indicator that they are not happy with the way the world is. And that indicator is getting angry. Getting angry is like experiencing pain. Getting angry is not a necessary criterion to see injustice and to fight injustice, but it's a useful mechanism for making sure that your conscience pricks you when you experience and see injustice. If you never get pissed off about injustice, you're probably also, in addition to that, unlikely to be moved to do something about it. So for me, the instrumental value of getting angry is very important, because anger can propel you into action. It's not necessary to get angry in order to do something about injustice, but I think emoting is the most obvious way in which we, in the first instance, respond to experiences of injustice. And so to think that anger and emotion in general don't have a place in intellectual life and political life is really to pretend that you have non-human beings who are implicated in injustices. But if you accept that it's human beings that are caught in this web of injustice, then you can't leave emotion at the door. I mean, it's just not possible. It's not part of a psychological makeup. And of course, the second part of the BS is much simpler. There's no correlation between emotion and rationality. So I enjoy emoting now. I do so freely. We've written about the place of emotion in philosophy of psychology, and the idea of the calm human being being more likely to think clearly is an absolute myth. The amount of white mediocrity that presents itself calmly is as prevalent as the amount of excellence that performs itself with emotion. And we can play example table tennis. The real threat for the person who doesn't enjoy seeing emotion in front of them is that they want to remain complacent about the injustices, and there's nothing like a calm container to help someone really not challenge themselves about the status quo. So for me, unless and until I see robust evidence of a correlation between emoting and losing your critical faculties, I remain profoundly unconvinced that that emotion crowds out rational thought, which is a big lie, and rationality itself is something that I think one can debate in terms of constructions around rationality that favor certain bodies over others. The last thing I want to say, just by way of concluding, is that it's been interesting. Sometimes, especially my white critics, think that black people enjoy talking about race. We really don't. I'd much rather we were actually talking about what I'm hoping to write about in terms of, speaking for myself as a writer, talking about illness and death and why a 37-year-old person is preoccupied with those topics, or what is the meaning of life, right? Or connections between mental illness and creativity, which fascinate me to no end. I'd far rather I was here and that was the conversation we had. It's not fun to talk about this. It's really not fun, because it gets awkward in the room. It's like people bite their nails. Some people say, this arrogant bastard can't wait to get out of here. I mean, I can see the thought bubbles. So I know that it's not fun. So interestingly, it only gets worse. And that's how much work we have to do. I found when I went back to Grahamstown, my hometown, that, and I disappoint black and white readers sometimes. I had some really awesome young black feminists who came to my book launch at Rhodes, who, when they thought I was berating the white liberals in the room, were like, and then of course one pushed back and said, in one of your chapters about young students, you compare Leishle, who's a master's student there and absolutely brilliant, to Ruth First, and really thought that was not appropriate. Why not Lillian Ngoyi? And I had to be hard on them, my own truth, that when I critique whiteness, that's not racism. There's a massive difference between the struggle against anti-black racism and the kind of racism that Andile Mngxitama peddles. We've got to make these distinctions clear. I'm not on board anyone's revolutionary politics that require me to pretend that Ruth First, as a white woman, is not an amazing South African. Any black person, any black woman who hasn't yet lived, who gets compared to Ruth First, should count their blessings, frankly. And if your politics say you're not radical enough, Eusebius, if you think that Ruth First is a white woman, you can say young Leishle reminds me of Ruth First. If anything, in that particular chapter, if there was a historical injustice there, it is the audacity to say that someone who's a master's student can already be compared to Ruth First, right? So I want to be very clear. This is not an anti-white message. There's a lot of things I say where I'm very happy with fellow black South Africans to be in disagreement with on the details. And that's a discomfort that I'm happy to live with, but that's one of the things that have come up in some of the book tour. But what I have found, and this no doubt will require us to talk more afterwards, maybe next weekend, what I found so fascinating, which I'd also like to write about at some point, is the emotional rupture and the cost to those of us who went to former Model C schools and private schools when we encounter our white sponsors who don't know what has happened to us in the meantime. And you go back with renewed black politics, and it's really hard. So I want to give you a story and end there of how that played out. So I had this woman asking questions, Penny Sparrow. She said, Eusebius at Rhodes, you are being elite. All this stuff about introspecting on your false beliefs. I mean, you're just being an intellectual elite. You can't expect every Joe Soap to be able to be reflective. Penny Sparrow is not necessarily reflective. And I laid into her. I really felt bad, but it was honest. When I said to her, basically what you're bloody saying is that one needs an IQ of 150 to know that black people are not monkeys. It doesn't take rocket science. Let's break this down. Let's not pretend there's an intellectual problem with what Penny Sparrow did. It's a simple racist problem. You can have an IQ of 80 and know that it's not appropriate to think of black people as monkeys. So we had this exchange, and it went on and on. Then she, and how many of you went to Model C? How many of the black people there went to Model C or private schools? You will appreciate just what's wrapped in here. And I think sometimes those of us who pretend to be more woke than others, we lie about how these things play out for us psychologically, the cost, right? Because we'd like to believe that we're now so radical, we don't go through this. It's time for the book signing. She's in the queue. And now the first bit of guilt comes in. And I'm like, oh shit, she bought a book. Now I really feel bad. And she's waiting a turn for the book to be signed, right? These are the distractions from the Justice Project. That's what I want to call them. And she comes closer, and I just smile and said, oh, you know, earlier Eusebius, when we were chatting, I actually had Mrs. Larkin in mind. Then I remembered this woman was at Graham College where I went to school. So it was one of my old teachers who obviously, you know, regarded me as the nice, quiet, colored boy from the poor neighborhood who's part of their Grow Our Timber project, as they called it. And it must be really hard for her to come and support me, and now hearing me say all these angry things, which you're only supposed to say if you never went to the other side. And she says, when I ask you that question about reflectiveness, I had Mrs. Larkin in mind, because Mrs. Larkin asked these questions. Now, Mrs. Larkin is the woman who ran the tuck shop at my school. And I said, oh, now I'm really flustered, right? I'm like, because when someone is right next to you, it's harder to talk about them than if they're sitting in the audience. I said, oh, no, yeah, but, you know, Mrs. Larkin. Yes, I remember Mrs. Larkin. And she says, leaning forward, you don't think Mrs. Larkin is a bigot, do you, Eusebius? Now, it may seem to you like a banal interaction, but I can't tell you the combination of emotional blackmail in that moment, the assertion of whiteness in that moment that she's appealing to, reasserting it, the attempt to wrestle back that sponsorship narrative of the young black kid in my school, and I'm coming back because she's now appealing to my memory of being in Graham College. It's very hard emotionally to deal with that. Which is why when I see, you know, and Panache is a friend of mine, Panache says, I don't need white friends. I'm like, oh please, you see your white friend at the Sandton City Mall and it's a different interaction, because these things are hard to deal with experientially, right? And so I was going through that in this exchange. And I said, yes, I remember Mrs. Larkin. I don't think she's a bigot. And I confirm. I said, but she's just an exception. I'm not really talking about her. And I signed her book. And then two parting shots, the one a bit more painful than the other. She says to me, oh, by the way, Mrs. Larkin said I must ask you, do you still enjoy minced meat samis, Eusebius? Now, I mean, exactly, right? You know, I mean, to unpack this to anyone who doesn't know what's going on in that example, the depth of the emotional blackmail in that conversational transaction. I had a very good discussion with Christy van der Westhuizen about 2 weeks ago, who helped me to fully unpack what's going on there. And I really want to tell that story and drill down into it in an essay. It's one of my writing projects. And earlier in the debate, I talked about why I get angry. And I said, because if I die here, inequities in this town, Echini, will remain. Like my sisters in the township, I'm the first person in my family to go to high school. They're very poor. Their fate is going to be the same. If I don't get angry here and about injustices, then nothing's going to change in this city and in this town. You know, my sister had a child who was pregnant in high school, just like she was, and I tell that story. Second parting shot of this old teacher of mine. She says, oh, by the way, your niece, she's in my class at Mary Waters. Two levels there of further inappropriate blackmailing. The one is, I still have familial proximity with you, Eusebius. So cut me some slack in this critique of white English liberals. We're not like that. I have now moved from Graham College, where you met me, and I've actually been a good white. I've now moved to a township school, right? So it's an attempt to show receipts, progressive receipts, to try and block the critical engagement of earlier. And to do so by signaling both, I now teach in the township, and I am actually also making sure that I help nurture your niece the way Graham College nurtured you. And that's how hard these things are. Now, those people who think that we enjoy talking about race and writing about it and get a kick out of it, now you've got to ask yourself, would I really, really want to upset so many people who are important to me? Because the most important intellectual influences in my life were straight white men. Both my teachers and also the people that I've read. And to go back and to rupture those relationships, there's a huge cost to it. So think about that the next time you think someone is just peddling racism. Thank you.
Okay, let's just juncture and open questions, comments. Please feel free to share it. Yes.
I found the last part, the conversation that you had with your former school teacher very interesting. Because for me it shows that there is not a common narrative. I think, when you talk about reality, there is not one kind of reality. Everybody has a different perception of reality. And
yes.
I can very well imagine that this teacher of yours understood this whole conversation in a totally different context, and that maybe your own insecurities, if I may say so, and your own narrative played into how you interpreted this whole kind of conversation. And often when we talk to people, when I as a white person talk to a black person, I don't have this narrative or the kind of understanding that he might or she might have when I approach her. So I think to do this whole kind of situation justice, I think your interpretation must not necessarily be the kind of interpretation that she had or the kind of intention she had when she said, I'm teaching at the school in the township. Maybe she just wanted to show, to share some information with you. Sometimes we understand the situation differently. And I think we should always keep in mind there is not one kind of reality. There is not one, we have different backgrounds and we interpret realities differently. I think this, just to this black and white.
Okay, so because I spoke longer than I intended, I'm going to keep my answers very short. And then anyone who wants to pursue conversation afterwards, I'm going to stick around because my flight is quite late. So forgive me for giving some terse responses. What you're suggesting is a very complicated, your comment leads to very complicated questions, so I won't do it justice in keeping the exchange short. The short answer is that because subjectivities are involved in how we interpret scenarios doesn't mean that everyone's interpretation is equally valid of how things play out. I think you're incredibly naive in turn and very unduly generous to imagine that nothing that was going on in that example had to do with the way in which people try and show their progressive receipts. In turn, I just think you're being naive. The South African reality is that white people want to feel like they're decent. And as soon as you come into a conversation where you have a narrative that upsets a self-description of myself as fundamentally decent and I'm not Dan Ruitt, and you now tell that person there's a more complicated reality where we're all in a continuum of problematic self-ascriptions. It's not nice when you think that you are the white person in your circle of friends who go into the township and do the work. So to imagine that she's merely innocently reporting information, I think is far-fetched. That's not the South African reality. I have no doubt her intentions are exactly as you describe. But we have to get away from a situation where we think, and this is true of morality in general, the same goes for gender. Intentions get way too much cachet in social and political discourse. If my intentions are pure, the effect of my speech, acts and behavior must be discounted. Well, no bullshit. I can cause irreparable harm with my behavior even if my intentions were not malicious. So this idea of retreating into the content of intent is something we cannot afford when there's an urgent justice project. And race is just one of them. The other is with patriarchy. There are many men who do not intend to behave in violent, sexist manner. It doesn't change the reality that is the nature of their behavior and the effect of their behavior. And as a philosopher, I've always protected intentions as important. And one of the shifts in my own convictions on these subjects over the last year and a half, conversation with some of my friends who write on this, like Wasiame Molefe, is that I take the effect of behavior much more seriously than I did before. I'm sure her intentions were pure. That's cold comfort to Eusebius.
I just want to progress on that. I came here today expecting a tough conversation, and I didn't find any of it tough. I don't disagree with anything that you said, except the ending. It makes me afraid to engage in good intended exploring your narrative versus my narrative, because I'm afraid that my narrative will make me say the wrong thing. And we need conversations. We need people to sometimes say the wrong thing so that you can get angry, so that you can answer me and be angry back, so that I can understand where that anger comes from. So we must also be careful that our dialogue is not so confrontational that we stop talking, because that's what we need, is we need to actually engage. I need to understand exactly where you come from, and I love the conversation today. But I don't want to be afraid that my narrative or my perspective is going to be so far from yours, it is so far from yours, that we can't have a conversation. That I can't learn, and you can't learn from me.
Look, this is a fascinating debate between activists on all justice questions, and it's one that I still grapple with myself, right? So, because I'm not an activist per se, I think I have a slightly more romantic response than activists. I think many activists will agree with you, but activists will disagree with one another. So here's what I'm getting at. You mustn't be racist. I mustn't be a patriarch. I have a duty to work on my patriarchal attitudes and convictions. You don't have a duty as a victim of my patriarchal behavior to educate me. If you are going to get pissed off and angry, and I become scared and police my own patriarchy around you, the question then becomes, should you feel guilty that you being pissed off about my patriarchy stopping me from asking tentative, weird questions about women? Are you responsible for that? The answer is no. Eusebius McKaiser, if he has the ability to be a sexist pig, also has the mental skill to learn how not to be a sexist pig. He can do the research. Go onto Google, go read what the feminists have to say. Speak to a guy friend of yours that you think has got it all sorted a little bit more than you do. So what I want to guard against is, it's not what you were saying, but sometimes it leads to this, the idea that victims of injustice need to take particular care to provide an enabling environment for a conversation to take place that may lead to better behavior on the part of the person whose behavior is problematic. That, I think, is absolute nonsense. So if the atmosphere becomes a little bit charged around the racism conversation, because the victim of racism now really getting angry after initially a beautiful unpacking of all the careful issues, no, you still have the duty as the beneficiary of racism or the purveyor of racism to work on your own implicated self in that relationship. So, and the reason why I said it's easier for me to have that view than an activist is that if I was an activist, and I know not all activists think this anyway, but you may think from a tactical point of view, Eusebius, if there's something you can do to ensure, if you've got two bits of behavior. Behavior A can result in 70% of the white guys you're about to talk to at some men's rest on campus to be better allies in the fight against racism. And behavior B will mean that only 2% will do. In a behavior B scenario, you get really, really angry and the atmosphere gets a bit sullied. In behavior A scenario, you keep it calm and everyone is kind of awkward but chummy. I really think it's profoundly misplaced and unfair and emotional blackmail and wrong to try and blackmail me into choosing scenario A. Because the work that the white boy has to do, who's a racist, or just even a beneficiary of racism, is work they must do independent of what modes of communication I take into that space. And that is something I want to guard, because otherwise we shift, as we do with conversations around sexual violence, we're effectively shifting the conversation from what will men do to stop attacking women to how will you protect yourself, and worse, what will you do to help a man think differently about how he's behaving. So that for me is the dilemma, but it's not a definitive view. You know, I accept that it's a somewhat intellectual view, but I've noticed the young activists amongst the students that there's a shift though towards what I'm saying. There's a recognition that the cost that comes with asking me to create the environment, and I'm happy to take it away from race. If I ask black women to think carefully about how they can get conservative patriarchal black men to be less patriarchal, because we're very patriarchal as black men, I think that's the wrong way of framing the burden. I don't think that a black woman needs to needs to do any work there. The work Jimmy, Mani, and I need to do as patriarchal black men in our attitudes towards black women in this country. That's a burden we have that's a moral burden we can't escape just because Sisonke isn't willing to help us out.
I have a quick question. You know, when I started reading your book, I had so many questions I wanted to ask you. I actually wanted to invite you for lunch, but by the end of reading the book, they followed 3 months of introspection.
You thought, oh, get near.
No, so my question is not is I don't know, perhaps a bit distant, but you know, with regards to conversations that take place currently and specifically on campus, because that's my situation, my circumstances, is that it becomes very polarized, and once you have a dissenting view, you know, that person is crushed. And by that I don't mean that it's being polarized or being radical is wrong. And by that I also don't mean that you know, you can't respond to that in an angry way. But do you think that because of the difficult nature of the conversation you're currently having, that is a natural consequence of destroying the person, making the dissenting view? Or do you think that it's still necessary for us to always be you know, guard against that? It's still an environment where, you know, dissenting views we engage with it instead of, you know, crushing the person.
Yeah, I'm going to disappoint you, I'm afraid. The aim is to be, you know, let's put it in an ideal context. We have duties to treat other people fairly and justly. I think it would be very easy for us to construct an argument for why that is universally true in any society, okay, where human beings view each other as equally deserving of dignified treatment. And so the question then becomes for me, what kind of introspection am I doing about where I'm at in my relations with other people in the country who look different to me? And where's my journey at? That's a deeply personal introspective journey that we need to be on. I'm not going to answer you directly, and maybe we can pursue it afterwards if I'm misunderstanding you, but when we have these meta conversations about how do we set up the institutional environment and the rules of engagement so that dialogue can happen, I really think that sometimes that question, as well-intentioned as it is a distracting question. Because if someone gets upset, that's no reason for us not to do hard work. And so I just don't prioritize for myself. That is an important question. How do we set up the best possible atmosphere for people to have dialogue? That's what I meant earlier. Maybe I articulate myself poorly. I don't think that's an innocent question. I think it's a distracting question. We must get on with just behaving differently and asking ourselves, how should I behave differently? Otherwise we get caught up in process.
Can I just ask one more question? How did you react to that lady? I mean, you said you were angry about this blackmailing of hers, you know, and she continued and continued. Did you signal to her any kind of, you know, dissatisfaction with the kind of conversation or the way the conversation went? I mean, the question for me is, you know, this is an example that you use. Mm-hmm. And I would expect, as a person that felt not good about this conversation, that you would have stood up to her and said, you know, actually I feel you're blackmailing me, or whatever you wanted to say, but signal to her, you know, even if you didn't have bad intentions, something in the conversation is not right. The way you address me, did you do this?
No, I did not. And for a couple of reasons, different sides of the same tragic coin. The one side was just cowering. Basically, in that moment, you become meek. So you retreat back to the 15-year-old who's at Graham College, walking away at prize giving with everything, getting the best speaker's prize for talking about why affirmative action is bad, which is a real part of my high school experience. So you become that person. So part of it was just me as a human being becoming psychologically smaller and less confident than when I was in performance mode looking up at the auditorium. Okay? That is the depth of whiteness and how it haunts those of us who have experienced proximity to whiteness. But the flip side of it is that, but this is me now just intellectualizing about it. In the moment, all that happened is what I've described. But my reflective answer, which is not the answer in the moment, is that, no, it's not my business. If I decide to go back to Grahamstown, the next time I go to Grahamstown, I want to go to the high school where she's at because I want to give a motivational talk to the coloured kids there. But I'm not going to take that opportunity. If I do, it will be a bonus for her. But what I'm unambiguous about is that I've got no duty to help her think through it.
It's not about her, it's about yourself. Okay.
I feel I'm at peace.
But you were angry. You were not at peace. You said you were angry.
Of course I was angry, and the example is illustrative about the emotional costs that we bear as black people when we rupture relations that were instrumentally useful in our development.
But you didn't develop, you didn't change anything in that situation. You had a situation, you had the chance to let that person know how you felt. And I think it would have been good for her as well as for you. I mean, this is the whole transformation process, it's all about change. And it's, you know, it's very secure to go back into a hall with students and to talk about it. But this is a difficult part, to have on one situation where you tell a person, a former teacher, white teacher, how you feel about the situation. And this is a conversation that needs to take place. And this is a emotionally conversation we need to have, not in a kind of space like this where we all articulate intellectual. It's a moment when you felt this anger.
Two quick things, then we must take fresh hands and whatever intervention Leslie has about the process at this point. Number one, don't ever prescribe to black people how to respond to the journey in making the country more just. If I say to you I'm emotionally too fatigued to talk to her, end of conversation. It would be no different to me saying to Faith, here's the best way to engage Leslie's patriarchy at Stellenbosch. Inappropriate. You know best how you want to engage that. Secondly, if I decide to speak to any white person, and here's the irony to your question, is that even if I say that sometimes we want to tap out, we actually end up not doing so. So the reality is that we actually open up the spaces for those conversations, even when we make partial argument for why we don't have a duty to do so. And the evidence of that is the book exists and this conversation is taking place, right? So this is actually in line with what you've said, ironically enough. But nevertheless, a white person who has to think about how their experience affected me in that conversation. You should be so lucky if I say to you, let's go for a cup of tea and I'm going to explain to you how I felt last week at Stellenbosch when that interaction played out and Leslie tried to intervene to avoid awkwardness because you sponsor the dialogue session. No, it is a bonus if I decide to have that conversation with you. It is not something I need to do because it's desirable to have as many white people as possible to be on point with the progressive race agenda. It's a bonus, but to frame it as you could have made the world a better place is to re-inscribe that burden onto me, and I'm afraid it's not your place.
Sure. The awkwardness that I wanted to speak about is the fact that
I'm joking. You were a prop.
a group of students from the United States entered, and I just wanted to warn you that they're entering. We can continue the conversation, and you're more than welcome to join. In the meantime, we can also start snacking. I think everyone
I don't mind that, yeah.
would like to ask questions still, but there's at least two hands that I'd like to acknowledge that would like to ask questions. I've seen that.
Okay, so shall we take one round and then maybe segue into the more informal eating and chatting? How will that work? So I'll take a couple. Who was first?
Maxine.
How's it, Maxine?
Yes. I just have a question that might seem simple, but also difficult at the same time. How do we get white people to do the work? How do we get them to want to do the work in the first place? Because it's not our responsibility as people of color, as you say, to educate white people. I share that sentiment with you. So but how do we get to that point that white people would want to? Because the kind of people that should be in this conversation today are not here.
Yeah. Fair.
I'm just going to maybe just build on what Maxine shared. The first round of questions made me very uncomfortable because the voices that were dominating the conversation were predominantly white, the level of engagement, the analysis and the rules of negotiation for the first round of questions before I had to take a phone call was very white. So I'm just interjecting because I think that it's important that we add another colored voice. My thing is that I think that it is frustrating to have conversations around race and expect black people to explain things. I think that we are far past that. I'm of the opinion that we need to have separate race conversations because different races and different groupings of people need to hear different messages. I don't need to constantly explain to a white person why you're racist. I don't need to talk through anyone my feelings of exclusion or justify my experiences of racism. I think white people in this country need to have an honest and a real conversation about subtle racism, modern racism. They need to take the responsibility of doing the white privilege work, because this kind of setting, for me as a black woman, is incredibly uncomfortable. It's incredibly uncomfortable, the fact that I now feel myself having to explain. I sat here feeling very uncomfortable because I was like, I had to almost have to bite my tongue, policing myself into some of the responses that I wanted to give. So my contribution is not a question, it's just a statement. And the statement is clear. I think white people need to do the work. I think black people need to really empower ourselves and speak and do different kind of work. But I think part of the work that white people need to do in this specific context, especially in Stellenbosch University, is take on the conversations of leading their own white discussions. It's becoming tiring having conversations around race and expecting black people to do the work. That's all that is.
Thanks. Okay, then yes.
Mine is not it's really just I like your parts are the anger. A couple of days ago, I was talking to some of my black friends. We have had a lot of rape incidences on campus, so a lot of people are running the end-rape culture campaigns and white people are involved for this end-rape culture thing. Of course, when you talk about the language policy, white people are nowhere to be found. So the other day, when I was talking to my friends, they were a permanent with they had organized that we had a march 2 a.m. This was the time when that horrible rape happened, and I was talking to my friends, like, so why didn't you guys go? And the response was, where were they when we had Christmas 4? We are still being told in Afrikaans, for white people. And now that it's a problem that affects them, now we have to wake up at 2 a.m. and support. But I felt uncomfortable in the fact that this was a rape incident, right? And rape is horrible. So how do we get past that then? How do we start? Yeah, I don't know.
Any other questions? Yeah? It's okay. Okay.
So thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. What really stood out to me is that I really loved your comment about when someone comes to you with an experience of racism and sexism and you treat it as something that goes against the norm. And that the norm is that society is racist and sexist. And I think just that shift in understanding really guides the way we actually address that issue and will move us closer to addressing how critical these issues are. We are, however, appearing to go the other way. And so my question is, how does one change that norm? How do you conscientize people around the norm is that society is racist and sexist, and that is not an exception, all these issues that's coming up? How does one do that?
Okay, that's a very difficult question. Any questions from the Americans?
They read your books actually as part of their course. So
oh, that's very kind.
I also wanted to meet you.
Okay, well, I'll stick around. So just to respond to a couple of these, I mean, I agree with everything Faith had said about the fatigue and the need for white people to have these conversations. You know, one of the essays in the book is entitled, I should remember, shouldn't I? What do black people want from me? And it's me trying to puzzle through this shopping list of actions that many white people, especially self-identifying progressive white people, want from black people to absolve them from racial guilt. And if I can perform these actions, then perhaps I'm contributing towards making society more just and all is now okay. And I don't think that that's an appropriate direction in which to put the conversation. For me, there's something very lazy about saying to you, Maxine, you know, I've just started a new job at Ellen Gray. I'm really, really scared that I might be saying something that will get me into trouble with the gender unit at work. What is the best way for me to avoid, you know, being accused of sexual harassment? So when I as a man outsource that question to you to give me tips on how to reduce the prospects of a sexual harassment charge at work, I think it's cheeky at the very least, and at worst, it really is incredibly lazy. That's work I can do on my own. So I totally agree with you. There's no reason why, if all of us as South Africans are fluent in the discourse on race in virtue of living in this country, there's no reason why we need to treat black bodies as expert bodies on racism. Racism is relational. Racism takes two for racism to be possible. So all of us have racism mimetically in our systems. And what that means is this idea that you can't have, it's one of the reasons why I'm not going to Franschhoek Literary Festival. You can't have a racism discussion unless there's a black body present. The black body has to mediate the racism discussion, right? Always be the case. And next door you can have the white body mediating the discussion about magic realism. But when it comes to the question of race, the black body has a monopoly on understanding it. And yet, the way race relations plays out, it necessarily takes two people of different phenotype before racism can even be possible. So my answer would be the same in response to you, that quite frankly, you know, your journey is your journey. Don't make it my journey if you're a white South African. You've got to have these conversations among yourself. What I would say is, which is what I was saying a couple of minutes ago, is that ironically enough, despite us pretending to be race fatigued, we've actually notched up a lot of conversation on the internet, in different fora, in writing, on YouTube. That's material that you can use to have that conversation with yourself or with friends. So even on the question of, you know, what could one say to this teacher of mine in Grahamstown, the truth is that for all my pretenses, I myself have written a lot on that question. And so the material exists there. But it's now up to white South Africans, just as it's up to us as men in the patriarchy version of the conversation, to go and eat from what has been put in front of us. And there, I'm afraid, there's a limit to what you can do. If someone is not willing to really dip into those conversations, then there's nothing you can do. And this is where I do have sympathy for a lot of the decolonization movements, that the demands of justice are important regardless of whether someone is willing to do the work or not. I hope that white South Africans will do that work, but it's not our place to come up with complicated tactics for how they should do that. The rape question it's too enormous for me to tackle at the tail end of this conversation. Next weekend we will talk about rape culture. It's probably not appropriate to say I'm looking forward to that conversation, but it is a very urgent conversation, and I think your question is hard and also intellectually interesting, because you would have thought that when it comes to rape, that identity politics and alliances shouldn't matter. But unfortunately, our South African reality is so riven by identity politics that who gets raped and whose rape it is we're marching for, unfortunately sometimes determine who's willing to go on that march. And it saddens me. I had a big fight with one of my closest friends, Karima Brown, who's a political journalist, on my Facebook wall the other day. And I think some of us, people who knew we were friends, were amused at our ability to disagree as friends. But we knew that we were skirting very close to being genuinely pissed off with each other. And the reason for it was that when Fezi Mtonti, who's a brilliant black woman who's doing a master's in politics, she wrote a really important thought piece on Friday that everyone should read, in which she talked about rape culture in this country, and she compared Jacob Zuma to, what's his name? Umani, and deconstructed his politics in light of both patriarchy, but particularly rape culture in this country. And Karima's intervention there was, let's not forget that Jacob Zuma was never found guilty of rape, which is true. But I thought to myself, my God, here's my friend Karima, who's an older black woman. I would have thought that her understanding of rape culture and the limits of a legalistic approach to understanding rape culture and the alliance with women would be a more important part of her identity in responding to that essay from Fezi than her political allegiances as a communist who also has an affinity for the ANC as part of the alliance. So there you had someone who made instantaneously a trade-off in that moment between their deep commitment of feminism, because I see it all the time, and her party political allegiances. You know, so those are very difficult conversations, and hopefully we will puzzle through some of that next week. I don't know how we do it in terms of a total package of responses. All I can say, which is very limited, is that in the spheres of influence that we individually occupy, we should role model the kind of language and behavior that we wish to become the norm. Practice saying casually, Bill Cosby is a rapist. If you want people to take seriously the fact that legal standards are not the only standards that can determine whether I believe women, practice that sentence in the common room. I think that he raped those women. Don't be shy to say that. I think it really has got to start at the micro level, and then hopefully we change from there. And of course it will be long and slow, but I think that's probably the best we can hope for now. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming to this afternoon. So we're going to have now some refreshments, and we can continue to engage with Mr. McKaiser, but I'd like to close this session so we can still engage with him. And as a token of appreciation, I'd like to transfer the certificate to you. You're now officially an honorary member of our institute.
Oh wow, thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.